Hey guys, let's start with the story tonight. Designer Emma and town archivist Thomas investigate the truth about the disappearance of female worker Lillian in Yorkshire's abandoned textile mill in 1923, and discover that dyes containing special minerals can make emotions affect reality through weaving. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I'm doing here. And tell me in the comments where you started tuning in and what time it is. It's always fascinating to see people from all over the world join us. In late autumn 2019, the winds of Yorkshire, sharp with the chill of the moors, swept across the weathered red brick exterior of Miller's textile mill. Vines curled dried between the broken window frames, like tangled old threads, isolating the century-silent factory from the rest of the world. The roar of the construction crew had lasted for half a month, and soon, this place would bid farewell to its past of cotton lint and rust, transforming into a cultural and creative park filled with cafes and art galleries. Emma Carter squatted in the corner of a storage room piled high with old archives, her fingertips gliding over the dusty wooden filing cabinets. As the lead designer of the renovation project, she insisted on sorting through these relics herself, not to save labor, but out of a near-stubborn reverence for this building that bore witness to the rise and fall of Yorkshire's textile industry. The storage room was dim, with only a small window letting in pale gray daylight, and the air hung heavy with the smell of dust mixed with old paper, making her cough softly. Still fussing over these old things? A voice came from the door. George, the construction crew foreman, poked his head in, his hard hat dusted with cement. It's getting dark. This place isn't safe at night. Just 10 more minutes. Emma didn't look up, reaching for a rusted-locked wooden box at the bottom shelf. The box was heavy, and she struggled to pry it open. Inside, instead of the contracts or account books she expected, there were only a few rolls of fabric wrapped in brown paper. She picked up one roll and unfurled it gently. The crisp crackle of the paper echoed sharply in the silent storage room. The fabric was deep indigo, thick in texture with frayed edges, clearly well used over time. It was woven with regular geometric patterns, interlocking diamonds and triangles, the lines fine and fluid. Emma leaned closer, and by the light of the window, she suddenly noticed strange outlines hidden within the seemingly orderly patterns. They weren't the decorative motifs popular at the time, but something more concrete. She frowned, adjusting her angle, and her heart skipped a beat. The outline was unmistakably a plane, shattered into pieces. The wings broken, the fuselage twisted, debris scattered in all directions, every detail vivid enough to send a shudder. Emma's fingertips brushed the fabric. The feel of the warp and weft was rough and real, but the eerie pattern made her blood run cold. This was a fabric sample from 1923. Though the label was faded, the words October 21st, 1923, Miller's textile mill were still legible. How could a textile worker in 1923 have woven a pattern of a shattered plane? Emma, George called again, a note of urgency in his voice. We really should go, wind's picking up. Emma snapped back to reality, rewrapped the fabric, and stuffed it into her backpack. Coming. She stood up, rubbing her numb knees, and glanced once more at the dim storage room, a strange feeling that someone was watching her lingering in her chest. As she walked out of the factory gates, the Yorkshire sunset sank behind the moors, painting the sky an eerie orange-red, and the distant valley loomed faintly in the twilight, like a silent mouth. Over the next 3 days, Emma felt haunted by that deep indigo fabric. She locked it in the iron cabinet of her studio, but at night, she couldn't close her eyes without seeing those interlocking diamonds and triangles, and at the slightest distraction, the outline of the shattered plane would appear before her. Determined to uncover the truth, she spent her days in the deepest corner of the town library's old reference room, which housed nearly a century of Yorkshire's local newspapers and industry archives. Dust swirled in the beams of light streaming through the skylights, and the air smelled of moldy paper. She hauled stack after stack of heavy 1923 aviation records, her fingertips tracing the yellowed, brittle pages as she searched word by word for any mention of planes. The records showed that British aviation was still in its infancy. In 1923, Yorkshire had only 2 small airfields, both used for military training, and civilian sightseeing planes were unheard of. The mainstream biplanes of the era were stubby with broad wings, entirely different from the sleek monoplane depicted on the fabric. To her confusion, she combed through the 1923 to 1924 local editions of the Yorkshire Post and even asked a contact to retrieve police accident records, but found no mention of a plane crash whatsoever. Am I overthinking this? On the afternoon of the 3rd day, Emma rubbed her throbbing temples, replacing the last document on the shelf. Rain streaked the window, dampening the old newspapers on the sill. She stared at her blurred reflection in the glass, wondering if the stress of the project had made her hallucinate. Perhaps the pattern on the fabric was just a worker's random brushstroke, and she'd let the idea of prophecy twist her perception, forcing a connection where there was none. She packed her things, resolving to set the matter aside and focus on the renovation design. But as she walked out of the library, her phone vibrated. A message from a colleague, attached to a photo of a recent small sightseeing plane model. It was exactly the monoplane she'd seen on the fabric. Her heart constricted, and the chill returned, creeping up her spine. She knew she could never truly let this go. That evening, Emma ducked into her usual corner cafe, hoping a cup of hot cocoa would warm her. The cafe was quiet, with an old radio playing soft folk music and a television in the corner showing local news. She found a window seat, slipped off her rain-soaked coat, and froze at the images on the screen. At 3 o'clock this afternoon, a small sightseeing plane crashed in Black Valley, northern Yorkshire, killing both passengers on board. The privately rented aircraft was flying in clear weather with no extreme conditions, and the cause of the accident is still under investigation. Rescue teams have arrived at the scene, where the wreckage is scattered across a wide area. The news anchor's voice was calm, but the footage of the wreckage hit Emma like a sledgehammer. The crashed plane was a monoplane. Its broken wings, twisted fuselage, and scattered debris matched the pattern on the 1923 fabric with eerie precision. Emma's hands trembled uncontrollably. She reached for her coffee cup, but missed, sending it crashing to the floor. Hot cocoa spilled onto her jeans, burning her skin, but she barely felt it. Patrons stared, and the owner rushed over to check on her, but she could only shake her head numbly. It's not a coincidence. It can't be. She muttered to herself, a single thought dominating her mind. The fabric wasn't a fluke. It was a prophecy, a warning from nearly a century ago. She had to uncover the history of Miller's textile mill in 1923, find the owner of the fabric, and reveal the secrets hidden beneath. She stood up abruptly, grabbed her backpack, and ran into the rain, ignoring the owner's calls, heading straight for the town archives. The cold rain soaked her hair and clothes, but it only sharpened her resolve. Truth lay ahead. No matter how terrifying, she had to pursue it. The Yorktown archives were housed in an 18th century stone building, its dark gray walls covered in slippery moss. The wooden sign above the door was faded, but the words Yorkshire Local Archives were still distinguishable. Emma pushed the door open, and a wind chime tinkled, cutting through the stuffy air inside. The scent of old things hung in the air, similar to the storage room at the mill but softened by the fragrance of wooden bookshelves, less musty than the library. Thomas Hart, the archivist, sat at a desk by the window, wearing black-rimmed glasses, ink stains on his fingertips, poring over a stack of old letters. His curly hair fell across his forehead, partially hiding his eyes, giving him a quiet, scholarly air. He looked up at the sound of the door, surprised to see Emma, soaked to the bone and breathless. "May I help you?" Thomas stood up, his voice gentle. Noticing her dripping hair, he picked up a clean towel from the corner of the desk. "Dry off first, it's pouring." "Did something urgent happen?" Emma took the towel, dabbing hastily at her face, her breath still ragged. "I'm Emma Carter, the lead designer for the Miller's Textile Mill Cultural Renovation Project." She introduced herself quickly, pulling the fabric, carefully wrapped in a plastic bag, from her backpack. "I need to look up records about Miller's Textile Mill from 1923, especially the owner of this fabric." She laid the fabric on the desk and unfurled it slowly. Thomas's eyes fell on the fabric, his gentle gaze freezing instantly, his fingers curling slightly, his breath catching in his throat. He hurried to the desk, leaning down to brush his fingertips lightly along the edge, as if touching something fragile and precious. This is the work of Lillian Hart." His voice trembled, his hand lingering on the fabric. "She was my great-grandmother, and the last worker to disappear from Miller's Textile Mill in 1923. Emma stared, shocked by how quickly she'd found a lead. "Disappeared?" "Yes. Shortly after a fire at the factory in November 1923, she vanished." Thomas turned to the shelves, pulling down a thick leather-bound archive book. The police investigated, but found no clues, and ultimately ruled it a disappearance. Her family kept some of her weaving tools and a few fabric samples, but this one, I've never seen it before. With Thomas's help, they hauled all the mill-related records from the archives, piling them high on the large reading table until it was nearly covered. The materials included factory operation logs, employee rosters, accident reports, and even privately donated diaries and letters. They worked from afternoon until midnight, the only sounds in the archives being the rustle of paper and their occasional whispers. As they dug deeper, a terrifying truth emerged. Over the nearly a century since the mill closed, 7 bizarre incidents had occurred, each matching a pattern found on leftover fabric from the factory. Look at this 1948 inspection report of the mill ruins. Thomas pulled a yellowed sheet from the stack, the handwriting faded. It says the inspector found a roll of fabric in the corner, woven with a pattern of a collapsing building. He thought it was a prank and threw it away. But 7 days later, the town's central bakery collapsed, killing 3 people who were buying bread. He pulled out a 1976 flood disaster report, a blurry photo of fabric tucked in the appendix. Rescue workers found this in the river near the mill. It shows floodwaters submerging streets. The photo was taken exactly 7 days before the flood hit. Emma leaned in. Even blurred, the fabric clearly showed water patterns and submerged buildings. What chilled them even more was how these incidents had been covered up in public reports. The 1948 bakery collapse was attributed to aging infrastructure, with no mention of the fabric. The 1976 flood was blamed on extreme rainfall, ignoring the prophetic pattern entirely. 2 incidents, and warehouse fire in 1962 and a bridge collapse in 1993, had no public reports at all, only brief entries in police internal records labeled accidents. But both noted the discovery of strange fabric. Someone is deliberately covering this up. Emma's voice was hoarse as she picked up a 1993 internal file, a handwritten note scrawled on it. Relevant evidence destroyed. No further disclosure. In 1948, the town's bakery collapsed, killing 3 people. Thomas pointed to a yellowed internal file, his tone grave. It records that a week before the collapse, someone found a roll of fabric in the mill ruins, woven with a pattern of a collapsing building. There was also the 1976 flood, the 2001 warehouse fire. All of them match. Emma leaned against the cold file shelf, a chill spreading through her body. Someone is deliberately covering these things up. Why? Thomas shook his head, his gaze fixed on the 1923 fabric. Perhaps to hide the mill's own secret. My great-grandmother's disappearance was almost certainly tied to these patterns. In Yorkshire in 1923, The late autumn chill was harsher than usual. Cold winds howled through the gaps in the mill's broken glass windows, carrying moorland dust and making the workshop oil lamps flicker. The roar of the looms was deafening, like endless thunder, drowning out the women's whispers. Cotton lint drifted through the air like fine snow, settling on their tired faces and dusty hair. Over time, even their eyelashes were dusted white. Rumors of a strike spread through the workshop like a plague, more despairing than the cold outside. The boss had announced at a union meeting a few days earlier that orders had plummeted. If the export order wasn't completed by the end of the month, half the workers would be laid off. Most of the women were married with families, and this job was their family's only source of income. The threat of layoffs hung over the workshop, thick with suppressed anxiety. To make matters worse, a flu outbreak had hit a neighboring town, killing several people. Coughs echoed through the workshop every day, and the women lived in fear, afraid of catching the flu and afraid of being fired if they fell ill. Rumors of war from afar added to their unease. No one knew if the fighting would reach their shores or make their already hard lives even worse. Lillian Hart sat at her loom, her fingers manipulating the threads with practiced precision, though her movements felt mechanical. Her eyes were unfocused. Lately, she'd noticed something strange about the fabric she wove. Whenever anxiety ran high in the workshop, when the women huddled during thread changes, whispering about layoffs, worrying about putting food on the table, or murmuring fears of flu and war, the geometric patterns she wove would twist into symbolic shapes. Sometimes they were broken lines, like snapped threads. Sometimes blurry shadows, like ghosts lingering on street corners. Other times, irregular splotches, like dried blood, carrying an ominous air. She looked down at the piece of fabric she'd just woven. On the deep indigo background, the edges of the diamond patterns were slightly distorted, their sharp corners blurred, like ink smudged by tears. Lillian reached out, brushing her fingertip over the twisted lines. The fabric was rough beneath her touch, but a cold dread settled in her chest. She remembered that the previous week, when anxiety about the flu had peaked, she'd woven a blurry human figure surrounded by tiny wavy lines. She hadn't understood what it meant at the time, but the next day, Isabella, another worker in the workshop, had been rushed to the hospital with a high fever, diagnosed with the flu. Isabella had survived, but the pattern had stuck in Lillian's mind like a splinter. Lillian, daydreaming again? Martha, the worker next to her, nudged her, her voice anxious. "Have you heard? Anna from the next workshop was laid off. She has 3 kids to feed." Lillian snapped back to reality, looking at the fabric on her loom. The diamond patterns had twisted irregularly, like a contorted face. "Martha, don't you think there's something strange about the fabric we're weaving?" Martha leaned in, then smiled dismissively. "Strange how? It's the same as always. These days, we're lucky to have jobs. Who cares if the fabric looks perfect?" Lillian didn't reply, but her doubts grew. During breaks, she secretly checked the other women's looms and found that nearly all of them had woven similar twisted patterns, especially when the group was overcome with anxiety or fear. At some point, a strange game had started in the workshop. During breaks, the women would use leftover scraps of fabric to weave small items. Handkerchiefs, coasters, small wallets, but the patterns weren't the usual flowers or birds. Instead, they wove their nightmares and fears. Scenes of being fired, family members falling ill, houses burned down by war. They called it weaving dreams, a way to release pressure. Every time they finished a nightmare pattern, their tense nerves would ease slightly. Lillian had refused to join at first. She'd felt uneasy about weaving negative emotions into fabric, as if the twisted patterns were alive, emanating a cold aura. But watching the other women throw themselves into it, forgetting their fears of layoffs and flu for a moment, she'd gradually been drawn in. Once, She'd had the same nightmare 3 nights in a row. She was trapped in the loom's threads, wrapped tightly from wrists to ankles to neck, the threads constricting until she couldn't breathe, darkness closing in. She'd woken up gasping for air, her heart pounding, covered in sweat. During lunch that day, she'd picked up a scrap of fabric on impulse and woven the nightmare into it. On the fabric, thin white threads wrapped around a blurry figure, the lines taut with suffocating despair. After weaving it, she'd felt a slight release from her fear, but a vague unease lingered. She couldn't shake the feeling that, by weaving her nightmare into the fabric, she'd unleashed something terrible. Before long, something terrifying happened. 3 women in the workshop, Martha, Isabella, and Lucy, had all woven burning beams patterns a few days earlier. Martha's pattern showed a terrified woman standing under burning beams, her own face. Isabella's depicted beams crashing down onto a loom. Lucy's was the most detailed, the flames' colors and the beams' grain vivid enough to send a shudder. At the time, the women had gathered around to look, joking that they were too imaginative and driven crazy by fear of layoffs. Martha and the others had just smiled bitterly, brushing it off. But on the night of the 7th day, a fire broke out in the mill's northern warehouse. That night, Lillian had been mending clothes at home when she saw a red glow lighting up the window and smelled something burning. Her heart skipped a beat, and she rushed out of the house, running toward the mill. The northern warehouse was engulfed in flames, towering 10 meters high, illuminating half the night sky. The intense heat pushed her back, making it impossible to get close. Other women from the workshop arrived one after another, standing at a safe distance, watching in terror. Some cried, some prayed, others whispered, "How could it catch fire suddenly? The warehouse is full of cotton. If the fire reaches the workshop, we're done for." It took firefighters hours to put out the blaze. The warehouse was reduced to charred ruins, with most of the cotton and fabric inside burned to ashes. The next morning, Lillian went to the mill with the other women, standing behind the police tape, staring at the wreckage. Charred beams lay on the ground, some still smoking, and the air was thick with the acrid smell of burned cotton, making her cough. Then her eyes fell on a broken beam. The position, the angle of the break. Even the burn marks matched the burning beam's patterns woven by Martha, Isabella, and Lucy perfectly. A cold wave washed over Lillian, as if she'd been doused in ice water. She turned suddenly to Martha and Isabella, and saw that they were staring at the same beam, their faces pale with terror. The fire scene was a mess. Charred beams lay scattered, and the air smelled of burned cotton. Lillian stood behind the police tape, staring at the ruins, her body cold. She thought of the 3 scraps of fabric woven with fire patterns, and the fear the women had felt as they wove them. A terrible thought crossed her mind. This wasn't a coincidence. From that day on, Lillian began secretly recording the connection between the fabric patterns and real-world events. She found a small leather-bound notebook, hiding it in the drawer of her loom. Every time she saw someone weave a strange pattern, she'd quietly jot down the design, the weaver's name, and the date, then watch closely for what happened next. She discovered that every pattern was followed by a corresponding event exactly 7 days later. No more, no less. She also noticed that the clearer the pattern, the more detailed the details, and the stronger the emotion the weaver poured into it, the more severe the resulting event. Once, a young worker, worried about her husband serving on the front lines, wove a vague pattern of a falling soldier. On the 7th day, she received word that her husband had been wounded, but survived. In contrast, the burning beams patterns woven by Martha and the others had been highly detailed, and their emotions had been intense. Anxious that a warehouse fire would derail the order and lead to layoffs, so the fire had been devastating. As her notes grew, Lillian came to a terrifying realization. The patterns didn't predict the future. They shaped it. Their fear, anxiety, despair. These intense negative emotions were transferred to the fabric, transforming into concrete patterns. And these patterns, in turn, acted like commands, turning imagined disasters into harsh reality. They weren't weaving dreams, they were weaving their own nightmares. "Emma, look at this." Thomas's voice pulled her out of her thoughts of 1923. He held an old map, marked with the mill's underground structure. "There's a hidden basement. There's no mention of it in the existing building records." The two decided to investigate the mill immediately. The mill was eerily quiet at night. The construction crew had stopped work, and the once noisy compound was silent, except for the wind whistling through the broken windows, like a woman crying, sending shivers down their spines. Emma and Thomas each held a powerful flashlight, their beams cutting through the darkness, illuminating piles of debris and discarded wood. They walked slowly along the mill's western wall, following the map, the crunch of gravel under their feet echoing sharply in the silence. When they reached the northwest corner of the mill, Thomas stopped, shining his flashlight on the ground. "This should be it." Emma leaned in, and by the light, she saw a thick blue stone slab covering the ground, moss growing in the cracks between the slab and the earth, clearly untouched for years. Faint symbols were carved into the slab, twisted and tangled like threads, or perhaps an ancient script, similar to the Romano-Celtic totems they'd seen in the archives. This must be the entrance to the sacrificial pit. Thomas knelt down, pushing at the slab, but it didn't move. "It's too heavy. We'll have to do it together." Emma nodded. They stood on either side of the slab, gripping its edges, and pushed. 1, 2, 3. Thomas counted, and they strained with all their strength. The slab shifted slightly, letting out a deep creak, like a giant waking from a 1,000-year sleep. They paused to catch their breath, then pushed again, moving the slab inch by inch. Beneath it was a dark hole, cold, damp air rushing out, mixed with the smell of earth, decay, and a faint hint of indigo dye. Emma shone her flashlight into the hole. She could just make out a steep stone staircase leading down into the darkness. After struggling for a long time, they finally moved the slab aside, revealing a steep stone staircase leading down into the dark. Cold, damp air rushed up, mixed with the smell of earth and decay. Emma turned on her flashlight, its beam illuminating a narrow passage in the darkness. "Be careful." Thomas led the way, warning her. The steps were covered in moss, slippery underfoot. After walking about 10 meters, the passage opened up into a small space, roughly half the size of the workshop. It was an ancient sacrificial pit, its walls hewn from rough rock, carved with strange weaving deities. The gods were slender, holding spindles, weaving threads that curled around them, extending to their feet and connecting with carvings on the ground to form a complete circle. In the center of the pit, scattered fragments of dark blue mineral dye lay alongside broken weaving tools, a rusted spindle, several snapped shuttles, their wooden handles rotted and crumbling at the touch. Emma approached the pit wall carefully, shining her flashlight on the carvings, her fingertips brushing the outline of a deity. The god's face was blurred, but it exuded an air of solemnity and mystery. The craftsmanship of these carvings is ancient, definitely Romano-Celtic. She turned to Thomas. People of this era often associated natural phenomena with gods. This weaving deity was likely their weaver, believed to control fate through weaving. Thomas knelt in the center of the pit, examining the mineral dye. He picked up a pinch, sniffing it. "It smells similar to the indigo dye my great-grandmother left behind, but with a distinct mineral scent." He placed the dye sample in a sealed bag he'd brought. "We'll have this analyzed. It should tell us its composition." Emma knelt down, carefully picking up a sample of the mineral dye. "This must be a Romano-Celtic relic. I never thought the mill was built on such an ancient site." Thomas studied the carvings on the wall. These patterns, They seemed to depict threads connecting heaven and earth. The weaver. Something clicked in his mind. My great-grandmother mentioned a weaver's sanctuary in her diary, saying the mill's location was special. They sent the mineral dye sample to a professional lab for analysis. A few days later, the results came back. The indigo dye used at Miller's textile mill during the Victorian era had been mixed with a special mineral from the sacrificial pit. This mineral contained a rare component Thomas named dream erosion stone. It could absorb and amplify intense human emotions, especially negative ones like fear and anxiety. At the same time, Emma and Thomas found more truths about 1923 in Lillian's leftover diary. The diary detailed Lillian's discovery. Miller's textile mill had been built directly on top of the ancient weaver's sanctuary. The women had been exposed to the dream erosion stone-containing dye for years, and their sweat had mingled with the fabric, transferring their intense emotions to the threads. The negative emotions of countless workers had converged, creating a collective fear resonance field through the fabric. The patterns they wove were physical manifestations of their emotions, and these patterns, in turn, influenced reality, turning fear into tangible disaster. Emotions are energy. The dream erosion stone is an amplifier, and the fabric is the medium. Emma looked at the diary entries, suddenly understanding. They weren't weaving dreams. They were weaving disasters. Thomas nodded. My great-grandmother realized that. She tried to stop it all. Lillian's diary was filled with her inner struggles. After realizing the patterns shaped the future, she could no longer weave in peace. Every time she picked up the threads, she thought of the disasters caused by the patterns, the warehouse fire, Isabella's illness. She decided to warn the other women, to stop weaving negative emotions into the fabric, to end the terrible dream-weaving game. During lunch that day, she gathered a few women she was on good terms with in the corner of the workshop, hesitantly sharing her discovery. The patterns we weave, they aren't just patterns. They come true. The warehouse fire, Isabella's flu. It's because we wove our fears into the fabric. She'd expected them to believe her, but instead, they laughed. Lillian, have you lost your mind? Martha frowned, her voice impatient. They're just patterns. How could they come true? The fire was an accident, and Isabella getting sick was a coincidence. Isabella nodded in agreement. You're just worried about being laid off, overthinking things. We weave these patterns to relax, otherwise we'd be driven crazy by the stress. Lillian's eyes filled with tears. She pulled out her secret notebook, flipping through the pages. I've written it all down. Every time a pattern appears, something happens 7 days later. It's never wrong. Believe me, if we keep doing this, something even more terrible will happen. But the women refused to look at the notebook, dismissing her as a fearmonger. Some even whispered that Lillian had made up the story to distract everyone, hoping to keep her job while others were laid off. Their words cut like knives. Lillian looked at the women she'd worked with for years and suddenly felt like a stranger. Word spread through the workshop, and more people thought Lillian was insane. Some deliberately wove nightmare patterns in front of her, teasing her. Lillian, do you think this one will come true? Someone left a scrap of fabric with a twisted face on her loom, scaring her half to death. After a heated argument with a coworker, Lillian was completely ostracized. The woman had woven a pattern of a fired woman. The figure looked just like Lillian. Lillian had tried to stop her, and they'd fought. The other women had taken the coworker's side, accusing Lillian of making a fuss and being hysterical. Anger, hurt, fear. Intense emotions swirled inside her, threatening to overwhelm her. She ran out of the workshop, crying in the cold wind for a long time, before dragging herself back to her loom. In a state of extreme agitation, she began weaving frantically. She didn't know what she was creating. She just poured all her emotions into the threads, her fingers moving rapidly on the loom. as if controlled by an invisible force. When she finally stopped, she looked down and saw an extremely complex pattern. A woman's body entangled and devoured by countless warp and weft threads, the threads piercing her skin, merging her with the loom, blurring the line between fabric and flesh. Staring at the eerie pattern, Lillian trembled. She knew this pattern was of her. Over the next 7 days, bizarre things began to happen. On the first morning, Lillian woke up to find a faint line on her wrist, like the warp and weft of fabric. So faint it was almost invisible, but she knew it wasn't a trick of the light. She rubbed her wrist vigorously, but the line remained. On the second day, it grew clearer, spreading from her wrist to her forearm. On the third day, tiny blue thread-like lines appeared on her skin, clinging to her like threads fallen from fabric. Worse was what happened to her vision. Starting on the fourth day, everywhere she looked, she saw overlapping grids, as if a giant piece of fabric was stretched across her eyes. When she looked at the loom, its outline was split into countless small squares by the grid. When she looked at her co-workers, their faces were covered in fine threads. When she looked at the sky, it became an endless expanse of blue fabric. Her body grew weaker by the day, exhausted, her energy drained by an invisible force. She knew she had become the next anchor for the collective fear. The pattern was tearing her from reality, pulling her into a bizarre world of threads and fabric. During those 7 days, she tried to destroy the pattern. But every time she picked up a pair of scissors, intending to cut the fabric, a sharp pain shot through her fingertips, as if she were about to cut her own flesh. She tried to run away from the mill, but when she reached the gate, an invisible force stopped her, like hitting a transparent wall. She realized with despair. She was trapped by the pattern, and no matter how hard she struggled, she couldn't escape being devoured. On the night of the 7th day, Lillian dragged her weak body back to the empty workshop. Moonlight streamed through the windows, illuminating the bolt of fabric she'd woven. To her horror, the fabric was writhing on its own in the moonlight, the threads stretching and coiling like living things. Lillian walked slowly toward the loom. She knew there was no turning back. When her fingertip touched the fabric, a powerful force pulled her forward. She felt her body dissolving, turning into countless tiny threads, merging with the fabric. After a moment of excruciating pain, there was nothing but darkness. She vanished completely from the real world, leaving only a perfect human-shaped pattern on the loom. A blurred figure wrapped tightly in warp and weft, as if sleeping deep within the fabric. So Lillian didn't disappear. She was devoured by the fabric she wove. Emma closed the diary, her voice hoarse. She and Thomas had read every word, each page filled with despair and fear. Thomas's eyes were red. She tried to stop it all, but in the end, she became a victim. As they mourned Lillian's tragedy, a new crisis was unfolding. Their research and investigations, their frequent trips to the mill and the sacrificial pit, had inadvertently awakened the dormant resonance field beneath the factory. Emma had been struggling with the cultural and creative park project. Investors were growing impatient with the slow progress, sending urgent emails and even threatening to pull funding if she didn't submit a revised plan by the end of the month. The construction crew was facing constant problems. The mill structure was more complex than anticipated, with multiple walls needing reinforcement, delaying the schedule repeatedly. Adding to the stress was the trauma of Lillian's story and the eerie patterns. With everything piling up, Emma was overwhelmed with anxiety, unable to sleep for days. Every night, she lay in bed, her mind racing with worries, tossing and turning. When she closed her eyes, she saw the twisted patterns and Lillian's desperate face. When she opened them, she thought of the investors' threats and the construction delays. Her mental state deteriorated. Her face was pale, dark circles ringed her eyes, and she'd lost her appetite. Her studio desk was covered in thick stacks of design drawings and project documents, but she couldn't bring herself to pick up a pen. Every time she tried to revise the plan, she felt irritable, unable to concentrate. That morning, Thomas arrived at Emma's studio to find her curled up on the sofa, her face ashen. Several sketchbooks lay scattered on the desk. Thomas picked one up and gasped. On the page was an eerie pattern. A car crashed into a roadside tree, its front end mangled, the driver's seat blurred, and the protagonist of the pattern was unmistakably him. He recognized the car, his old Ford. "Emma, did you draw this?" Thomas's voice trembled. Emma slowly lifted her head, her eyes empty. "I don't know. I couldn't sleep last night, picked up a pen, and when I woke up, these were here." She paused, then suddenly realized, "This pattern, it's like Lillian's, isn't it?" Thomas nodded, placing the sketchbook on the desk. "The resonance field has been activated. Your anxiety, channeled through the sketchbook just like the fabric back then, has become a pattern. And this pattern predicts that I'll be in a car accident in 7 days." Fear flooded Emma. "It's all my fault. If I hadn't insisted on investigating, the resonance field wouldn't have been activated. This isn't the time for blame." Thomas took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. Lillian wrote in her diary that events happen 7 days after the pattern appears. "We have a week. We have to find a way to break it." The two delved deeper into Lillian's diary and the mill's historical records, searching for a way to reverse the weaving of disasters. They moved all the materials to Emma's studio, covering the desk and even piling them on the floor. Thomas sorted through Lillian's diary, looking for key information about the resonance field and the patterns. Emma searched the mill's historical archives, hoping to find more about the dream erosion stone and the sacrificial pit. "I found it!" Thomas suddenly exclaimed, looking up from the diary. "My great-grandmother wrote that the dream erosion stone is the core of the resonance field. It absorbs and stores emotional energy, then releases it through mediums like fabric, influencing reality. If we destroy the dream erosion stone vein, we can completely sever the connection between emotions and reality, ending the cycle of weaving disasters." Emma leaned over, reading the diary entry, but frowned. "But this is too risky. Look at this geological report. The dream erosion stone vein has existed underground for thousands of years, tightly connected to the surrounding rock. And it's absorbed nearly a century of negative emotional energy, like a giant energy bomb. If we destroy it forcefully, the released energy will spread across the entire town in an instant." They fell silent. Destroying the vein was a permanent solution, but the risk was too great. They couldn't gamble with the lives of the entire town. "Is there another way?" Thomas muttered, flipping through the diary again. Time passed, and the sky grew dark outside. Only a desk lamp lit the studio, casting light on their tired faces. Emma rubbed her sore eyes, taking a sip of cold coffee, and a thought struck her. "Wait," Lillian said, "negative emotions shape disaster patterns. What if we do the opposite? Use intense positive emotions, hope, love, courage, to create a new pattern. Could that neutralize the negative energy and reverse the cycle?" Thomas's eyes lit up. "It's possible. Emotions are energy. Positive energy should cancel out negative energy. Just like light-darkness. A pattern woven with positive emotions might overwrite and neutralize the disaster patterns." But his smile faded. "But we need a suitable medium like the fabric back then. And we need emotions strong enough to counteract nearly a century of negative energy. That won't be easy." Time passed, and the date of the predicted car accident drew near. Emma and Thomas searched for a suitable medium, eventually finding an ancient spindle and a roll of unused indigo fabric among Lillian's belongings. It was the fabric Lillian had planned to use for a vision of hope, but never got the chance to weave after being ostracized. The 7th day arrived. The sky was overcast, dark clouds hanging low, as if ready to pour rain. Thomas drove to the mill to meet Emma, preparing for their final attempt. His hands trembled on the steering wheel, the image of Emma's sketch haunting his mind, his heart racing. He forced himself to focus, slowing down, driving carefully along the country road. As he rounded a bend, a heavy truck suddenly barreled down the hillside opposite. The driver seemed to have lost control. The truck swerved wildly, heading straight for him. No! Thomas's eyes widened. He jerked the steering wheel and slammed on the brakes. The tires screeched against the road, leaving a long skid mark before the car crashed into a roadside tree with a loud bang. The front end crumpled, glass shattering everywhere. Thomas's forehead hit the steering wheel, and sharp pain shot through him as blood trickled down his face. He opened his eyes, dazed, staring at the twisted wreckage. Only one thought crossed his mind. The pattern had come true. Fortunately, he'd been wearing his seatbelt. Though his forehead was bleeding and his arm was cut by glass, he was alive. The truck driver climbed out of his vehicle, rushing over in panic to check on him, and called an ambulance. The ambulance arrived quickly, taking Thomas to the hospital for treatment. The doctor bandaged his forehead, telling him to rest, but Thomas couldn't sit still. His thoughts were with Emma and their plan. After a quick checkup, he ignored the doctor's protests and rushed to the mill. The pattern's power is growing stronger. Thomas arrived at the mill, his voice urgent. If we don't act now, something even worse will happen. Emma was ready. She held the spindle and the indigo fabric, along with the chemical neutralizer Thomas had prepared, and slipped into the underground sacrificial pit again. In the center of the pit, the ancient loom ruin still stood, its metal parts glinting coldly in the flashlight beam, its wooden frame blackened but sturdy. Emma approached the loom, gently touching the cold frame, as if she could feel Lillian's despair and helplessness as she wove there decades ago. She took a deep breath, securing the fabric to the loom. The fabric was thick, carrying a faint indigo scent, as if Lillian's presence lingered in the threads. Emma thought of Lillian's words in her diary, her efforts to stop the disasters, the lives lost to fear. She thought of Thomas, his courage in joining her investigation, his determination to come to the mill even after the accident, the town's hope for a better future. Intense emotions surged within her. Sorrow for the tragedies of the past, admiration for Lillian, trust and worry for Thomas, and unshakable hope for the future. She pulled a small fruit knife from her pocket, slashing her finger without hesitation. Bright red blood dropped onto the indigo fabric, like red plums blooming in snow. She quickly poured the chemical neutralizer Thomas had prepared over the blood. The mixture reacted with the fabric, deepening its color while adding a warm glow, as if the cold fabric had suddenly come to life. Emma picked up the spindle and began to weave. She had no pre-planned pattern. She just poured all her positive emotions into the threads. Her fingers moved awkwardly at first, but soon grew smooth, as if guided by an invisible force. She wove countless branching paths, each leading to a different future. Some sunny, some blooming with flowers, some filled with laughter, symbolizing the infinite possibilities of free will. The future wasn't predetermined. It was a choice. She wove scenes of sunlight breaking through dark clouds, golden threads dancing on the indigo fabric, dispelling the gloom. She wove smiling faces, elders' kindness, young people's vitality, children's innocence, each expression vivid and lifelike. She wove patterns of hope and love intertwined. Red threads for love, golden threads for hope, twisting around each other, supporting each other, forming a warm net. Weaving was extremely difficult. Intense emotions made her tremble, sweat pouring down her forehead, her arms aching, but she didn't dare stop. She knew what she carried on her shoulders. Thomas waited anxiously outside the sacrificial pit, listening to the hum of the spindle inside, his heart pounding. He checked his watch repeatedly. Every minute felt like an eternity. He could feel faint energy fluctuations from underground, sometimes cold negative energy, making him shiver, other times, warm positive energy, chasing away the chill. He knew Emma was battling nearly a century of negative energy. All he could do was pray for her success. After what felt like an eternity, the hum of the spindle stopped. Emma emerged slowly, holding the woven fabric in her arms. Her face was pale, but her eyes were bright. Inside the sacrificial pit, the ancient deities carved into the walls seemed to glow with new life. The two returned to the surface, rushing to check the old fabric samples. A miracle happened. The eerie disaster patterns on the old fabric faded slowly, eventually disappearing completely, leaving only the clean indigo background. At that moment, a long sigh of relief echoed from deep beneath the mill, as if nearly a century of grief and suffering had finally been released. Emma felt a warm breeze brush her face. She turned and saw a translucent female figure flicker at the entrance of the sacrificial pit. Wearing a 1923 textile worker's uniform, her face blurred, but with a look of peace and relief. "It's Lillian," Thomas whispered, her spirit finally free from the prison of the fabric. 6 months later, the renovation of Miller's textile mill was completed. But instead of the cultural and creative park originally planned, it was transformed into the Textile History and Spiritual Memorial. The exterior retained the mill's original red brick structure, with only the broken windows and walls repaired. A stone tablet stood at the entrance, inscribed with 8 characters, "Remember the past, we've hope." Inside, the memorial was divided into 2 exhibition areas. One displayed historical materials about Miller's textile mill, Lillian's diary and weaving works, and the old fabric samples that had once predicted disasters, each accompanied by detailed explanations, telling the story of this long-buried history. The other area showcased Emma's vision of hope fabric, framed in special glass. Under the lights, the deep indigo background sparkled with warm golden and red threads, filling visitors with strength. On the opening day, nearly the entire town turned out, along with many people from neighboring areas. They stood before Lillian's works, whispering about the tragic history, their faces filled with regret. When they reached the vision of hope fabric, they were moved by the warmth and hope it embodied, lingering to admire it. Thomas's family came too. His grandmother cried as she read Lillian's diary, finally learning the truth about her own grandmother's disappearance. Emma stood in the crowd, watching their reactions, her heart filled with joy. She had honored Lillian's efforts and the trust of the town. Emma and Thomas held weekly weaving classes at the memorial, teaching the townspeople weaving skills. The classes were held in the memorial's activity room, and every session was packed. Young girls, middle-aged women, retired elders, even a few mischievous children joined their parents. Emma and Thomas prepared colorful threads and fabrics, teaching basic weaving stitches patiently, guiding each student. They always emphasized the importance of keeping a bright mind while creating, infusing positive emotions into their work. Weaving isn't just a craft, it's a form of emotional expression. Emma often told the students, negative emotions make works feel oppressive, while positive emotions fill them with vitality. Our hands can weave disasters, or weave hope. It all depends on the emotions we choose to pour in. The students agreed wholeheartedly, striving to stay calm and joyful while weaving. Some wove love for their families into scarves, others hope for the future into wallets, and still others passion for life into tablecloths. More and more people joined the classes. They not only learned weaving skills, but also found release from stress and shared warmth in the process. The activity room was always filled with laughter and the hum of spindles. One day, a 7-year-old girl named Lily, Thomas's distant cousin, joined the class. She loved drawing and crafts and was curious about weaving. Unlike the other students, who followed set patterns, Lily wove freely from her imagination, using pink, yellow, and blue threads to create a pattern of a garden blooming in rain. On the fabric, deep blue raindrops fell from the sky, while roses, tulips, and sunflowers bloomed brightly in the garden, vibrant and full of life. Emma admired the work. "Lily, this is beautiful, full of hope." The little girl smiled happily, treasuring the small piece of fabric, keeping it carefully. To everyone's surprise, the next day, a rare heavy rain hit Yorkshire, big drops pounding the ground, turning the world gray. Everyone expected the town to be left in a mess, but after the rain, the sky cleared suddenly, and a beautiful double rainbow appeared over the town square, its arc stretching over the central garden. The flowers in the garden, refreshed by the rain, looked even more vibrant, exactly like the pattern Lily had woven. News spread quickly through the town, and everyone thought it was magical. Lily was overjoyed, rushing to the memorial to find Emma and Thomas, holding her weaving. "My pattern came true. The rainbow really appeared." Emma knelt down, patting her head with a smile. "Because when you wove it, your heart was filled with longing for beauty. That positive emotion gave the pattern power, bringing us this beautiful rainbow." Emma and Thomas stood in the square, watching the crowd laughing under the rainbow, smiling at each other. The sun shone warmly on them. They knew the dream erosion stones still lay underground, and the emotional resonance field hadn't disappeared. But it was no longer an echo chamber of fear. It had become a resonance box of hope. People's positive emotions, channeled through the ancient art of weaving, had been passed to the land, neutralizing the old negative energy, turning this once place of disaster into a home that nurtured hope. From then on, small, warm miracles began to happen in the town. Someone wove a pattern of a bountiful wheat field, and soon after, the town's farms had a bumper harvest. Someone wove happy cats, and the next day, the stray cats near their home found warm shelters. Someone wove a busy market, and the town's weekend market became more lively than ever, filled with the bustle of daily life. These little miracles filled the town with warmth and vitality, strengthening everyone's belief in the power of positive emotions. The winds of Yorkshire were still sharp, but as they blew over the memorial's red brick walls, they carried a warm touch, as if filtered through countless positive emotions. The dark clouds that had once hung over the mill were finally scattered by the sun. In the memorial's activity room, the hum of spindles and people's laughter could be heard every day, weaving together into a warm melody that echoed over the town. Emma and Thomas stood by the memorial's window, looking out at the sunny street and the passing crowd, their faces filled with happy smiles. They knew the story of weaving and hope would continue. In the years to come, more people would come here, learn to weave and share warmth, using their hands to weave a better future. And Lillian's spirit, at long last, had found true peace in this land of hope.